In the cold months when the fjords froze shut and the sky wept ash instead of snow, whispers passed between the elders of the northern clans, old tales half buried in the ice like forgotten bones. They spoke of a place high beyond the known peaks, veiled in perpetual mist, where a mountain tribe neither wholly of this world nor the next held dominion. These were no gods, nor men, but something else, shadows of Amir's kin, it was said, steeped in the first earth's fire and the forgotten runes that came before Odin's tongue shaped them into song. No road led there, and no map marked its name. Yet those who dreamed of conquest too boldly, or wandered too far in search of silver and glory, sometimes vanished into those pale heights. And when the snow finally melted, the wind brought with it screams like flutes carved from bone. It was in such a season that the war band of Rolf the Black sailed inland, their longships scraping against frozen reeds as they came ashore near the cliffs of Vetrador. The trees there rose like spears, ancient and blackened by storms, their boughs heavy with old snow and stranger things. The air had a taste of iron, and even the wolves gave way as the warriors disembarked. Rolf, tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard stiffened by salt and frost, stood at the prow until the ice moaned beneath him, then stepped ashore as though planting a flag in the skull of a fallen enemy. Behind him came Ulfr the Godless, rune-priest and skald, his eyes pale as cataracts and his fingers wrapped in blackened wool, ever whispering to the wind. They had heard the rumors. A village gone silent. No smoke from chimneys, no tracks in the snow, only stillness like a held breath. Some said raiders from the east had taken them, but Rolf did not believe in eastern ghosts. He believed in conquest, and in that still valley, he believed there might be something worth taking. The warriors moved like a ripple of shadow through the woods, leather and iron creaking, their breath rising in plumes as if the forest itself exhaled through them. Crows wheeled high above, their cries long and drawn, as if morning before death had even come. They reached the village by dusk. What they found was not ruin, nor blood, but absence. The homes, carved of dark pine and thatched with mountain moss, stood intact. Fires still smoldered low in hearths, untouched. Bowls of broth sat on tables, long cold but unspilled. Snow had drifted in through open doors, softening everything to stillness, but there were no bodies. No signs of struggle. Only silence, deep as the grave and twice as patient. "This is not the work of men," murmured Ulfr, his breath thick with the cold of unseen things. He knelt beside a doorway, touching the frost-rimed threshold. Beneath the snow, etched in bone-white runes, lay a symbol none among them had seen before, an eye without pupil, ringed in broken thorns. The others gathered, murmuring, gripping the hilts of their seaxes and axes, though none dared draw steel. Even Rolf narrowed his gaze and spoke no boast. Night fell quickly in the valley, the sun vanishing like a coin swallowed by dark water. Stars refused to come, and the moon remained hidden behind a shroud of unmoving cloud. The warriors made camp at the center of the village, surrounding themselves with fire, though the flames seemed reluctant to burn. The heat reached no farther than their hands, and the shadows clustered close, too thick, too still. As they ate, there came a sound not made by man or beast. A low hum, like stone grinding against bone, rose from the mountains. It was not loud, but it set their teeth on edge, and many looked to the heights where mist clung like rotted wool to the slopes. Then came movement, slow and impossible. A line of figures, distant and half-seen through the gloom, descending the mountainside not by path but over it, as if the world bowed beneath their feet. Rolf rose first, silent, jaw set. The warriors followed suit, each clutching weapon though no command had been given. But it was Ulfr who spoke, his voice low and dry. "They do not come to fight," he said. "They come to collect." The figures drew nearer, their shapes gaining clarity only as they crossed into the bounds of the village. They were not cloaked, but wrapped in what looked like the flayed bark of trees, stitched with cords of braided hair. Their faces were masked with bone, antler, and soot, and behind the masks burned eyes that shimmered like moonlight on black water. They carried no blades, only staffs of ashwood carved with the same thorn-ringed eye. The warriors stood frozen. Not from fear, they were men who had braved berserkers and gods alike. but from something older. A weight pressed into their minds, as though the air itself had become too heavy to breathe. Rolf moved first, lifting his axe with a grunt, but as he stepped forward, his foot struck the earth and did not rise. Roots, dark and thin, had grown around his boot. He strained, but they thickened like hands, pulling him downward with slow, deliberate force. Screams broke the silence, not from mouths, but from within, as the men felt their limbs betray them. The staff-bearers spoke no words. They only gestured, tracing symbols in the air with fingers too long, too jointed, and the warriors fell like felled trees, their muscles slack, eyes wide in horror. Ulfr alone remained standing, muttering broken phrases in Old Norse, calling upon gods who had long turned their faces away. The staff-bearers turned their gaze upon him, and Ulfr screamed, not in fear, but revelation. "They are not men!" he spat. "They are what men feared before fire." Then he, too, fell, hands still shaking in the shape of a ward. As dawn broke over the valley, the village stood quiet once more. No footprints marked the snow. No flames flickered. And the longship, moored on the ice-choked river, came loose of its own accord and drifted back into the current, empty save for a single black feather where the captain once stood. The wind along the fjord's throat blew hollow, like a horn sounded for a battle that had already been lost. In the days that followed the vanishing of Rolf the Black's war band, no birds sang along the slopes of Vetridor. The woods had grown too quiet, too watchful, as though the trees themselves bent in conference, whispering of what had returned to the world. Word of the vanished men spread like frost across the mountain paths, carried not by messengers, but by those old women who lived half in shadow and half in tale. Their eyes milky and their fingers knotted like roots, they spat into fire pits and muttered of the eye that watches, and of chains woven from thought, not iron. South of the silent valley, beyond the river Svarthelga where the current ran black beneath cliffs as sheer as a blade, there stood a ring fort known as Grimhall. Built from stones scavenged from barrow mounds and older, stranger ruins, Grimhall had stood for generations as a bulwark against raiders and trolls alike. Its lord was Stenulf W.I. Remtooth, a grizzled warrior with one eye pale from a wound left by a Draugur's cursed blade. Stenulf trusted no man who feared dreams, and yet when a scout named Frodi returned from the north, pale and stinking of his own terror, even the lord of Grimhall listened. Frodi's tale came in fragments. Of dead fires still warm. Of footprints in circles, not lines. Of a hill that pulsed as though it breathed, and of voices that spoke not aloud but within the bones. He had followed the black-feathered trail upriver, hoping to glimpse the longship of Rolf, or some sign of the missing men. What he found was a stand of trees grown in spirals, bark peeled back to reveal smooth flesh beneath, carved with the rune of the broken eye. No birds, no beasts, only a humming in the ground that made his teeth chatter. He had fled, and the forest had followed, silent, watching, moving without sound. Stenulf summoned his huskarls. 20 men, hardened by years, each scar a stave in the saga of their survival. They listened without jest, for even the bravest among them had heard old tales, half lost, of the mountain's curse. They had thought them fit only for fireside drunkenness and frightened children. Now, in the stillness of the hall where the smoke from the hearth refused to rise straight, the stories gained weight. One man, Ragnar Flintney, spat and made the sign of Thor, but no one laughed. They set out at dawn, their breath rising in plumes like spirits fleeing the body. The cold bit deep, not from air alone, but from the land itself, as though something beneath the snow drank heat with a hungering mouth. They passed the drowned cairns of forgotten clans, where the stones leaned not from age but from some unseen pressure. The river grew narrower as they pressed north, ice creeping up the banks like fingers reaching for warmth. The trees changed shape, longer, leaner, their limbs like arms thrown up in surrender. On the third day, they reached the mouth of the valley. A fog clung to the cliffs, unnatural and yellow as old parchment. It did not shift with the wind. It breathed. Stenulf raised a hand, and the men halted. Their eyes narrowed as they gazed into that veil. Then from the mist stepped a single figure, barefoot, robed in something between fur and fungus, its face hidden by a mask of scorched bark. It bore no weapon. It spoke no word. But it raised its hand, and the air grew heavy. The warriors of Grimhall gripped their blades. Steel rang in frost-bitten air. Ragnar stepped forward, his axe held high, bellowing like a storm loosed from the earth. But as he charged, his legs failed him. Not from fear, not from wound, but as though the ground itself had forgotten to let him pass. He sank into the snow with a cry, not vanishing, but drowning slowly in a bed of white that writhed like serpents. The bark-masked figure tilted its head and turned without a sound, vanishing back into the mist. They dared not pursue. Stenulf ordered the men to retreat, not in cowardice, but in grim understanding. This was no war of blades. The enemy they faced wore no flesh that blood could betray. They returned to Grimhall with Ragnar's axe but no body. That night, none of the men slept. A low thrumming filled the stones of the hall, and the hounds refused to howl. At midnight the dream came. Not to one but to all. A mountain split open by a root of light. A voice like wind through reeds, speaking in runes that bled when read. A hall beneath the stone, carved with walls that wept memory and floors that pulsed like hearts. And in the center, seated upon a throne of ice wrapped in chains of whispering ash, was a woman crowned with antlers, her eyes full of storm. She opened her hand, and the warriors saw themselves not as they were, but as puppets, their limbs guided by unseen strings of thought. Stenulf woke with blood upon his tongue and a scream lodged in his chest. The others woke in silence, their eyes red and minds bruised. One man, Vala, did not wake at all. His mouth was full of earth though he had not left his bedding. Where his heart had once beat, there was only the mark of the eye. That morning, the sun did not rise. Not behind clouds, but not at all. The sky hung like stone, pale and dead. Snow fell upward, then sideways, then not at all. The trees groaned as if under weight too great to name. In the village below the hall, children pointed to the cliffs and spoke in voices not their own. The forge fires would not light. The meat rotted in cellars. And beneath the stone floor of the hall, something began to knock, soft, rhythmic, insistent. The people of Grimhall prayed, but the gods did not listen. Stenulf, now gaunt and grey about the mouth, stood at the threshold of his hall and looked north. He held a strip of bark, blackened and still damp with something not water, and he knew then that this enemy could not be slain. Only bound. But to bind it, one must first see it whole. And to see it whole, one must enter the mountain. Alone. So the tale moved from man to shadow, from fire to fog. And the old women, whose tongues wagged like ravens on wind-blown gallows, said the eye had opened again. Not to destroy, but to harvest. For the mountain was not only a place, but a hunger, and the tribe at birth were its fingers. Cold, cruel, and patient. In the bleak stretch of land between the shattered cairns of the old road and the river that hissed like a serpent through black ice, there trudged a lone shield maiden named Freydis, daughter of Ingmar the Cold-Eyed. She bore no companions, no banner, no ship tethered to her name, only the memory of her brother, Kol, last seen vanishing beyond the ridges of Vetrado with Rolf's doomed war band. The trail had long since vanished beneath snowfall that gleamed dull as bone, but the wind still whispered strange syllables in the hollows of the rock, and Freydis followed them as if they were threads from a loom spun by the Norns themselves. Her boots cracked through brittle ice, her breath forming brief halos in the dark, and her axe swung at her side, heavy as a burden owed to gods long dead. The land itself seemed to reject her. Frost clung not just to stone and tree but to memory, biting into her thoughts with cold fingers. The trees grew close, too close, their trunks warped and bending inward like conspirators in silent council. From time to time she would pass under branches hung with objects not made by man, bundles of hair, bones carved into spiral shapes, stones bound in leather and marked with the thorn-ringed eye. She never touched them. She spoke no words. The silence around her was not merely absence of sound but a living thing, vast and expectant. On the seventh dusk, as the sun bled out behind the jagged peaks like a wounded stag, Freydis came upon a hollow in the hills. There lay remnants of a camp, cold ash in a ring of stones, a half-buried horn cup, and a length of fur cloak caught on a bramble like a flag of surrender. She knelt beside the fire pit, brushing snow away until her fingers met the runes carved into the stones beneath. They were not runes known to the Skalds or carved on any staves she had ever seen. These were older, jagged and looping, like the scratching of claws on a frozen hide. Her hand hovered over one, and the wind fell dead. In the stillness, a distant wail echoed, low, inhuman, and drawn long across the sky like the cry of a mourning god. She did not sleep. The stars did not come. Instead, above the hollow, clouds churned and opened to reveal something far worse than darkness, a sky without shape, a dome of moving mist and unseen eyes. Friday sat by the cold pit, axe across her knees, staring into the void above until her eyes watered and her limbs grew numb. Then came a rustling, not from the brush, but from beneath the ground, as though roots stirred and stretched beneath her. Her name was spoken, not aloud, but within, the syllables curling in her mind like smoke. She stood, but her body felt heavy, as though the snow had climbed into her bones. From the shadows at the hollow's edge stepped a form, a child at first glance, small and narrow, cloaked in rags of bark and feather. But as it moved closer, she saw its limbs were jointed in the wrong places, its gait not made for earth. Its face was not a face but a mask of clay painted with ochre spirals, its mouth wide and unblinking, eyes black pits of still water. Friday raised her axe, but the figure did not flinch. It lifted a hand, not in threat, but in summons, and pointed toward the north, where the rocks rose like jagged teeth into the night. Then it turned and walked backward, each step silent, each movement unnatural. Into the snow it vanished, not fleeing, but dissolving into the air like mist. Friday waited until morning, though morning never quite came. The sky only paled slightly, turning the darkness from black to blue-gray, and the frost upon her cloak shimmered like a burial shroud. She rose and followed where the child had pointed, knowing the land itself had become her trial. She climbed the slopes of the dread fangs, each footfall cracking ancient ice. Here the world became less a place and more a wound, rocks that bled rust, trees that leaned away as she passed, and birds that sang only once before vanishing. At one point she found an altar, a stone table grown over with moss and streaked with old blood. Upon it lay a human jawbone wrapped in horsehair, and pressed with nails in the shape of the eye. Beneath it, carved into the stone, was a warning in the old tongue, beneath stone sleeps thought. Touch not the chain lest the chain touch you. Still she climbed. The wind died. The frost lifted. And in its place came warmth, not natural warmth, but the breath of something ancient that lived deep within the mountain. The snow around her feet melted as she passed, revealing earth black as pitch, and moss that moved when watched too long. At the summit she found a gate, not of iron, nor wood, but of bone, its posts formed from spines bound with sinew, its lintel carved with faces howling in silence. Friday paused, placing her hand to the cold bone, and in that moment she saw. Not with her eyes, but with whatever deeper vision the gods once gave to those who carved runes in stormlight. She saw the mountain open like a mouth. Saw halls beneath it lined with chanting figures. Saw her brother kneeling, slack-faced and hollow-eyed, a rune carved into his forehead glowing with pale blue light. He was not dead, but unmade, a shell wrapped in another will. Behind him loomed the throne of moving roots, and upon it sat a woman taller than any man, robed in ash and crowned with fire. Her hand reached out, and the vision snapped shut. Friday fell to her knees in the snow, gasping. The gate before her remained, and now the runes glowed faintly, welcoming her in a language not spoken in Midgard for 1,000 years. She knew then the path was set. She would not leave the mountain unchanged. Either she would break the chain, or join it. Behind her, the wind moaned through the trees like a dirge. Before her, the gate opened without sound. She stepped forward into the dark. The mountain swallowed her whole. The path beneath the mountain was not hewn by mortal hands. It curved in ways that defied stone, folding back upon itself like the coils of a slumbering serpent. The walls sweated cold mist that drifted in the narrow air like breath from unseen mouths, and the rock underfoot felt less like earth and more like flesh, soft, veined, humming with a pulse older than time. Fridas walked without torch or guide, for the darkness here was complete, and yet not blind. The runes that once glimmered on ancient altars now traced faint blue veins along the tunnel walls, pulsing dimly as if recognizing her passage. She did not speak. Even the thought of words felt dangerous, as though sound might wake something waiting too long. Behind her, the gate had sealed soundlessly, and the stillness that followed was absolute. No echo of her footfalls returned. Even her breath made no whisper. She moved through that silence like a thread through a buried loom, and as she passed, the mountain changed. Walls breathed open, then sealed behind. Stones shaped themselves into symbols that rearranged as if retelling a story written long before memory. There was no sense of time, no way to mark day from night, pulse from hour. The mountain existed outside of such measures, and Fridas soon felt her heartbeat begin to fall in line with the deeper rhythm beneath her. Then came the voices, not with sound, but with presence. Shapes stirred in the walls, their forms stitched from root and ash, their limbs too long, their faces hidden behind masks of copper and feather. They did not move as men moved. They flickered, like flames seen through water, one moment near, the next impossibly far, always just beyond reach. She felt them not in her skin, but in her blood, and each step became heavier, as though her lineage itself resisted the weight of what she was becoming. Eventually the tunnel opened into a chamber vast and domed, its ceiling veiled in a mist that glowed with inner moonlight. Beneath it, great pillars rose, twisting columns of petrified wood and bone, spiraling in patterns no Norse carpenter would carve. Between them hung chains, hundreds, maybe thousands, swaying slightly though no wind stirred. From each chain dangled a figure, men and women in armor of every age, some in Viking mail, others in skins and beads from lands far beyond the sea. Their bodies hung slack, but their eyes moved. They watched her with awareness. Not pleading, not hostile, simply waiting. One by one their mouths opened, and though no sound emerged, she felt words pass into her bones. "You are late, daughter of stone. The seed has flowered in blood." Beneath the chained ones, the floor rippled. What had seemed stone revealed itself to be moss, dark and glistening, pulsing like a tide. Shapes moved beneath it, huge, slow, and old. Eyes opened in the earth, watching her without blinking. Fridas stepped forward. The moss parted. A circle of smooth black glass lay beneath her, a mirror to the ceiling mist, and in it she saw not her reflection but her brother. Cole stood in a vast hall carved from living rock, his hands bound with braided hair, his mouth sealed with golden thread. He knelt before a throne made from roots and ribs, and on that throne sat the antlered queen, tall as a tree, draped in veils stitched from the skins of forgotten beasts, her eyes glowing with stormlight. Her fingers moved slowly, weaving unseen sigils in the air. With each motion, Cole shuddered as though something was being pulled from within him, memory, name, soul. Fridas clenched her fists. Her axe had grown heavy, the haft sweating in her grip. Around her, the chains began to sing. It was not a sound but a vibration, a pressure in the lungs and teeth. The figures above swayed, and the walls flickered again. One of the masked ones stepped forward, taller than the rest, cloaked in black leaves and crowned with beetle shells. It raised a hand, and Fridas felt her limbs lock, her spine stiffen. "She is not yet woven," the figure intoned, not aloud, but in the air around her. The tongue was ancient, yet she understood. "I seek my kin," she said, her voice like stone breaking frost. "Release him." The masked one did not move. "He has already crossed the veil of bone. His will is no longer his own. Yours follows." Fridas raised her axe. It glowed faintly now, runes awakening along the blade, runes carved by her father before the sea took him, runes meant only to be called upon in blood oaths. The mountain shuddered as the blade lit, and for a breathless moment, everything stilled. Even the chains fell quiet. Then the masked one lowered its hand. "The root must test the branch," it said, and vanished. A new path opened, the walls tearing away like flesh from a wound. Beyond lay stairs, winding downward, lit by a light that did not flicker and cast no shadow. Fridas stepped onto them. She did not know if they led to salvation or to death. It did not matter. In the mountain, there was no difference. She descended for what felt like days or heartbeats. The deeper she went, the warmer the air grew, moist, heavy, rich with the scent of rot and blooming things. Fungi bloomed on the steps, wide, flat caps glowing blue. Insects with transparent shells watched her from the walls, their wings humming without sound. Below, she began to hear a sound at last, the slow throb of something vast, breathing. At the end of the stairs stood a door, not a crafted thing, but a living membrane, pulsing slowly, ringed with roots that curled inward like claws. It bore the eye, that same broken ring seen in the woods, on bones, in dreams. The pupil moved as she approached, tracking her. The door did not open. It simply receded, folding away like wet parchment, revealing a final chamber. Inside stood the antlered queen. She was taller than Freydis had imagined. Her face was both young and ancient, carved from ash wood, her eyes endless wells of grey stormlight. Her fingers ended in roots that grew and writhed into the walls behind her. Cole knelt at her feet, his mouth still sewn shut, his eyes dull as snow. The queen regarded Freydis not with hostility, but with sorrow. "You are the last of the line," she said, her voice layered with echoes. "And you are already bound." Freydis lifted her axe with both hands. The chamber darkened. The runes on her blade flared white. "I am not yours," she said. The mountain groaned. The queen rose. And the roots began to move. The battle did not begin with a cry but with silence breaking. It cracked through the roots like ice underfoot, sent tremors through the living walls of the chamber, and turned the air to weight. The antlered queen rose from her throne of bone and black ivy, her gaze steady upon Freydis as the last daughter of the stone bloodline stood ready, axe raised in defiance. Cole knelt beside the throne unmoving, the golden threads that sealed his mouth twitching slightly as though some memory fought to surface. The light in the chamber shifted, no longer blue nor white but something older, dimmer, like the glow beneath ice at the bottom of a lake, where drowned things dream. The roots unfurled first. Slow and deliberate, they slipped across the stone like serpents tasting the air, barbed and wet, carving channels in the floor as they moved. They did not rush her. They encircled her. Each tendril bore the faint shape of runes within its bark, and with each passing moment, the symbols rearranged, changing meaning, spelling incantations in a forgotten tongue. Freydis backed away, one boot braced against the shifting moss, and her blade shone with a pale defiance. Her breath came slow, not from fear but from the pressure, for the very mountain pressed down upon her like a god's hand. "You come as breaker," said the queen, her voice the hiss of wind through dead branches. "But your line was the first to kneel. You bear the mark of the chained." Freydis stepped forward, axe at her shoulder, speaking through clenched teeth. "Then I come to unmake the binding." The queen tilted her head, and the roots surged. They came like waves, writhing, snarling, gleaming with inner sap, but Freydis did not yield. She turned her blade in a slow arc, and the runes flared again, this time with voices. Not hers, but those of the dead, her ancestors, her father, warriors lost beneath snow and sea. Their song was not loud, but it cleaved the roots where it struck. As her axe swung, the first of the tendrils hissed and recoiled, cleft open to reveal pulsing nerves of fire. But the queen did not flinch. She raised her hand, and with it the chamber itself seemed to breathe. From the far end, shapes emerged from the stone. Wraiths in armor twisted by roots and lichen, faces sealed in bark masks, eyes empty. These were the taken, warriors from every age, their souls not slain but rewritten. Among them, she saw the tattered sigils of Rolf's band, and the eagle crest of Grimhall's lost Huskarls. One stepped forward, a woman with red braids bound in leather, her arms still gripping a rusted shield, her eyes brimming with blue fire. Freydis knew her by name, Ursa, her mother's blood sister, vanished 15 winters before. "Let me pass, kinswoman," Freydis called. The wraith did not respond. It stepped forward, sword dragging behind like a dead limb, and struck. Freydis parried, sparks leaping in the dim. Behind her, the queen's roots circled tighter. The other wraiths advanced. Each blow carried the weight of memory, clashes on the moors, duels beside fjords, raids under starlight, and each moment of combat cut deeper than steel. Freydis moved like one possessed, her muscles honed by hardship and grief, but she knew the battle was not one of arms alone. Every strike she landed was returned in kind, and the roots fed on fatigue. Blood ran from her brow into her eyes, but her grip did not falter. She ducked a blade carved of bone, rolled through a knot of vines, and severed another root with a roar. Then the queen whispered a name, Cole, and the chamber changed. He rose from the foot of the throne, his limbs slow, like waking after drowning. The golden threads unwound from his lips, falling like dead leaves, and his eyes, clouded with ancient commands, locked upon her. He stepped between her and the queen, swordless, open-handed. "Do not!" Freydis breathed. His voice came hollow. "You must kneel. It is the only way." She shook her head once. "If I kneel, you are lost." He raised his hand, palm outward. "I am already lost." She saw it then, not the mask upon him, but the thread still winding down his spine, glowing faintly, reaching back into the throne, into the queen. It pulsed with each word he spoke. Not his voice. Not his will. He was a puppet, lips moved by something beneath the earth. "I will free you," she said, stepping forward. He did not resist, nor embrace. He stood, trembling, as she reached forward and pressed her axe to his chest, gently, reverently. Her hand reached beneath the chain mail, to where the thread met flesh. She whispered a single word, one not spoken in any tongue of men but carried from her dreams. Fate. The thread shivered. The queen hissed. A crack opened in the chamber, hairline but deep. A tremor passed through the roots. Cole gasped, eyes clearing for a breath before they flooded again with shadow. Freydis pulled him forward, but the roots surged, wrapping around her legs, her waist, her throat. Her axe fell, clattering against the stone. Still, she clung to her brother, arms locked as the roots dragged them toward the throne. Then, a sound like nothing else. A horn, long and low, from far above, deep in the mountain's belly. It did not belong to this place. It came from outside. A call of warning. A call of war. The roots froze. The wraith stopped mid-step. The queen rose fully from her throne, her antlers brushing the ceiling mist. "The outer world remembers," she said. "Too soon." Freydis seized the moment. With a cry that split her throat, she drove her heel into the root at her feet. Her boot shattered, bone cracked, but the thread in Cole's spine snapped. Light, cold and white, poured from his back like smoke in reverse. He screamed once. Then silence. He fell limp in her arms. Unbound. The roots withdrew. The chamber dimmed. The queen sat once more, her expression unreadable behind the veil. "You will return," she said. Freydis rose, breath ragged. "Not alone." Then the mountain began to quake. The roots retracted, the chamber shuddered, and the stone beneath her feet shifted. A path opened behind her, narrow, steep, slick with blood, sap, and ancient oil. She dragged Cole's limp form across the threshold, and the darkness swallowed them once more. Far above, in the frozen skies of the waking world, the first storm of the season broke. Lightning carved the ridges of Vetor in half. The mountain did not scream, but it remembered. The river below the mountain ran black and swollen, choked with the melt of ancient ice, its surface glossed with floating slivers of bark and bone. In the shadow of Vetor's cliffs, the wind shifted and turned, no longer free but bent by something vast and watching. Snow fell in strange patterns, spirals, loops, glyphs that vanished the moment a man tried to trace them. Ravens circled without sound, dozens at a time, their wings still as sails, eyes fixed not on prey but on the horizon. In the longhouse of Halder the Stoneborn, there had been no fire for 3 nights. The hearth refused to catch, even with dry timber and oil poured by hand. Smoke would curl but collapse. Flame would hiss but never rise. And the old men sitting around the unlit pit no longer told stories. They only listened. It was on the third dusk of this dead flame that a scout returned from the northern gorge, shivering though his cloak was thick with wolf fur. His name was Skjar, and he had gone into the wild seeking word of the missing sons of Eldervac, the youngest of whom had vanished near the old trail once used by traders from the west. His face was grey beneath the frost, and though he had lost no limbs, he stumbled as though he carried great weight on his back. He would not cross the longhouse threshold until Halder himself met him at the gate, placing a hand upon the man's chest and murmuring the protection prayer of Heimdall. Only then did Skjar speak. "There is something in the snow," he rasped, eyes fixed on the rafters above. "Something beneath it. It watches. It listens. And it breathes through stone." Halder said nothing. He led the man inside, offered him the broth made with marrow and clove, and gathered the other elders. Together they listened as Skjar spoke of the white path that curved where it should not, of tree roots grown in cymbals, and of a hollow in the mountainside where he had found the remains of a shrine. No god's name marked it. Only a circle of blackened stones, in the center of which lay a single rune carved into slate, the eye, unblinking, thorn-ringed and cracked through the center. "I saw her," he said, his hands trembling around the bowl. "A woman crowned in bone. Her breath made the trees bow. She walked without sound, and where she passed, the snows sank into the earth." At this, the eldest of the Hearthguard, Van Wonerd, stood slowly. He took from beneath his tunic a pouch of stitched bear gut, and opened it with fingers warped by age. Within lay a carved tooth, yellowed and ancient, upon which was inked the same rune. The old ones stared. Few had seen it before. Fewer still dared to speak of it. "My father saw the mark," Ben said, voice gravel-thick. "Before the fjord froze the first time. He called it the watching root. Said it comes when bloodlines are too long unbroken. Said it grows through kin as it does through soil." Halder rose, his eyes narrowing beneath the weight of generations. "Then the time is shortened. And what was once buried has begun to reach upward." That night, the sky wept silver, not rain nor snow but soft flakes that glowed faintly as they fell, vanishing before they touched the ground. The hounds in the village howled not toward the sky but toward the mountain. Children woke with blood upon their tongues and could not speak until dawn. And in the deep woods beyond the village, where the trees grew too tall and too close, something was digging, not with spades, but with memory. Freydis returned by dawnlight, dragging her brother across the ridge where the old watchtower stood in ruin. Her cloak was shredded, her boots soaked in pitch, and her eyes hollowed by what she had seen. Cole no longer spoke. He walked now on his own, but without will, his gaze flickering at shadows that no one else could see. She brought him to Halder, and the old man received them without question. Only once did he glance at the boy's neck and see the scar, fine and red, the shape of a thread burned into flesh. "She took part of him," Freydis said, her voice flat. "But I took him back." Halder nodded once. "Then we have little time before she comes to reclaim what was hers." For 3 days the villagers prepared, not for battle, but for binding. Runes were carved into stone circles, herbs were burned that had not been touched since the death of the last rune mother, and the skalds beat drums, made from stagskins soaked in iron-rich water. Freydis stood at the center of it all, her axe reforged with a blade of black obsidian taken from the mountain's spine. She did not speak of what lay beneath, only that it breathed, and it knew their names. At the edge of the village, Cole stood alone. He spoke to no one. But at night, his voice could be heard, repeating a phrase in a tongue none knew, low and slow, over and over, until the ravens cried back to him. When the queen came, she did not come with fire. She came with fog. It rolled down the cliffs like milk spilled from the jaws of the gods, thick and cold, swallowing sound and shape. The sentries vanished one by one, their cries muffled into silence. The first to fall was Van, whose eyes turned white before his body collapsed inward, folding like paper. The second was Skjar, who stepped forward into the mist and was never seen again. The third was the sky, which closed itself to moon and star and turned the world into shadow. Freydis stood at the gate, Cole beside her. The mist parted before them like cloth torn at the seam. And there she stood. The queen was taller now. Her limbs were bark and breath, her crown no longer antler but root and ash. Her eyes burned without flame. The ground beneath her cracked and bled sap. She raised no weapon. She needed none. "I come to finish the weaving," she said, voice heard inside every skull. Friday stepped forward, black blade gleaming. "The loom is broken. Your thread is cut." The queen tilted her head, and the earth around them groaned. "But the pattern remains," she said. "And you are already inside it." Then the sky split. Not with thunder, but with song. A deep old note. One that had not been sung since the first tree was felled by man. It came not from Freydis, nor from Kol, nor even from the skalds who trembled in the shadow of the longhouse. It came from the stone beneath their feet. And the queen paused. And in that pause, the old gods turned their gaze once more upon Midgard. The sound that split the sky rang not like thunder but like the groan of a mountain waking from its age-long slumber. It rolled down the slopes of Vetro with the weight of prophecy, cracking the ice along the river's back and shaking frost from the limbs of trees that had not moved in generations. The queen stood still in the village threshold, her cloak of root and bark lifting slightly in the unseen wind that rose with the sound. Behind her, the mist recoiled like a tide disturbed, revealing glimpses of shifting silhouettes, creatures neither wholly man nor beast, their limbs coiled like vines and their faces blank as old masks. The villagers dared not speak. Even the ravens, who had borne witness to bloodlines rising and falling since the age of giants, had vanished into the heights. Freydis did not lower her axe. The obsidian edge glinted darkly beneath the clouded sky, and her feet remained firm upon the carved runestone where she had taken her stand. Kol remained behind her, mouth slightly open, a faint line of blue light still pulsing along the scar down his neck. He had not spoken since the fog returned, but his hands now clenched and unclenched at his sides, and his breath came shallow, as though something within him fought to rise. The queen's gaze drifted to the rune circle etched into the earth before Freydis. The ancient glyphs burned faintly now, their power flickering like oil on water. She raised one hand, fingers splayed, and from beneath her nails, fine tendrils of living bark slithered outward. They stretched toward the circle but halted an inch before the stone, hissing softly, curling back. She lowered her hand. Her voice, when it came, was softer than before but colder. "The bindings you have scratched upon the skin of this world are pale echoes of what lies beneath," she said. "I wove the first runes before your kind walked upright. I bound will in stone, and thought in breath. What you resist is not conquest, but remembrance." Freydis spat into the earth. "Then remember this, we are not yours." The sky darkened again, not with storm, but with memory. Shadows passed over the village that had no source. Each hut, each tree, each soul became a page upon which some unseen scribe wrote its fate in silence. Children hid beneath the benches, eyes wide, lips moving in prayers forgotten even by the gods they named. The longhouse timbers groaned, and the iron nails holding the roof began to turn black, twisting as if reluctant to hold back the dark. Then came the walking ones. They emerged from the forest line on all sides, figures wrapped in layers of root, moss, and weathered linen, their faces hidden behind masks carved from the skulls of wolves, deer, and once men. Their feet made no sound upon the snow, and where they passed, fire died and birds dropped from the air. They moved toward the village like a noose tightening. Behind them came a dragging sound, as of trees uprooted and hauled across stone. Halder the Stoneborn stood upon the hill behind the longhouse, flanked by the few remaining warriors whose minds had not broken in the night. His beard had turned silver-white in the space of hours, and in his hand he carried a spear older than any song, its haft carved with spirals and runes in a tongue no man had spoken in 900 winters. He watched the walkers descend, and his voice was heavy as a death drum. "So the woven ones return." Freydis heard the name and understood. She had not spoken it aloud in her time beneath the mountain, but she had felt it inscribed in the very marrow of the earth. Woven, not born, not made but braided from thought and decay and the breath of buried gods. The queen was not queen alone, but high among them, first of those who bound soul to stone, who sewed fear into the fabric of the world. Still, she stepped forward, one pace, and stood outside the circle. Her body trembled from cold and from the nearness of something impossible, but her voice held steady. "If you seek to enslave us," she said, "then you must do so in flesh, not fog." The queen's body shifted, joints creaking like timber in deep frost. Her face remained unreadable beneath the shifting veil of her crown, but the forest stilled. For the first time, something like a breath escaped her lips. "Then let flesh speak." She reached to her side and drew forth a blade, not of steel, but of something older, glistening black and etched with glowing veins of green. It pulsed with a rhythm that echoed from the roots beneath the village. The villagers recoiled as she stepped into the snow, and the ground beneath her feet did not yield but shivered. Friedis raised her axe. The queen moved with a grace that did not belong in the world of men. She glided forward, her form blurring slightly, as though glimpsed through water. Friedis braced, stepped aside at the last moment, and brought the blade across in a wide arc. The axe met something. It sang against the queen's weapon with a sound like wind through cracked bone, and sparks leapt between them, not fire, but visions. Flashes of old halls buried beneath stone, of children asleep beneath cursed roots, of runes burned into the sky above. They broke apart and clashed again. The villagers watched, paralyzed, as two figures danced in a storm not of weather but of fate. Every strike shook the ground. Every movement rewrote the wind. And then, at the edge of the circle, Cole screamed. His back arched, and from his mouth poured not blood, but light, cold and sharp and white. It struck the ground and split the earth, revealing a buried ring of iron beneath the runestones, a remnant from the days when giants had been bound by human hands. The queen staggered. Friedis seized the moment. She drove her axe downward, not at the queen's form, but into the center of the rune circle, through the light Cole had summoned. A sound like the cracking of the sky rang out. The queen screamed, not in pain, but in rage, and her form split at the seams, the woven bark and root unraveling into ash and wind. The walkers faltered, their masks falling from their faces. Beneath them, many were empty. Others wept. A few collapsed and did not rise. Then came silence. The fog lifted slowly, like a veil unspooled by time. The sky returned to its cold gray, and the snow resumed its fall. The queen was gone. Only her crown remained, resting atop the broken ring of iron, humming faintly with warmth. Friedis fell to her knees. Cole collapsed beside her, breathing still. And across the fjord, in the high reaches of the cliff, something old stirred once more. The battle had ended. But the pattern, once begun, would never sleep again. In the deep hush that followed the battle, the village of Eldervac lay wrapped in a silence not born of peace, but of aftershock. The snow no longer fell in spirals or whispered shapes, but straight and slow, as if the sky itself were weary. Smoke curled from a few rekindled fires, rising in cautious spirals from the chimneys of longhouses whose timbers still creaked with memory. The queen's crown remained where it had fallen, nestled among the splintered stones of the broken ring, its twisted antlers wet with meltwater and the black sheen of old sap. None dared touch it. Not Friedis, who sat near it with hands bloodied and breath ragged. Not Cole, who now slept deeply, curled like a child beside the fire pit with a faint glow still pulsing from the scar beneath his throat. And not Halder, who watched from afar with the eyes of a man who had glimpsed something too old to name. They buried the fallen at dusk, as the ancient rites demanded, wrapped in cloaks of fur and sealed with iron nails, each body placed beneath stone cairns carved with runes to confuse the dead. The drums did not sound. The horns did not call. This was not a burial of warriors, but of wards, an act of sealing, not mourning. They did not speak the names of the dead aloud, for names had power, and what had come from the mountain might still be listening. Then was laid first, his one remaining ear wrapped in a braid of ashwood, and upon his chest they placed the broken haft of the rune spear he had once carried into frost-born battles. He did not look at peace, but no one did any more. That night, As frost crept across the inside of the longhouse windows and the winds shifted like wolves pacing unseen, Freydis sat before the hearth with the old seer-woman Irmla. Irmla had not stirred from her hut in 2 winters, and her eyes were veiled with cataracts like grey river ice. Yet she had come down from the ridge with her staff of yew and her sack of bones and feathers, muttering that the bindings had thinned, that the root had loosened its grip. She stared at Freydis now, not with blindness, but with something far older than sight. "You tore the pattern," she said, voice like dry grass. "But the loom still stands." Freydis did not reply. Her fingers were still trembling, though not from cold. The obsidian axe sat at her side, cracked along one edge. In its runes, nothing glowed. "The queen is dead," she said at last. Irmla shook her head. "She was a root tip. A whisper of the deeper stem. The mountain still breathes." Outside, the wind howled once, low and long, and the longhouse groaned in answer. Cole stirred in his sleep, murmuring something in the same dead tongue he had spoken under the mountain. Freydis watched him with the guarded eyes of one who had seen kin unmade and remade. The boy's soul had not been wholly reclaimed. Something lingered behind his gaze now, something that knew more than any boy should. By morning, the first signs began to appear. The snow at the base of the cliffs had darkened, not red, but black, and not from ash, but from veins of something moving beneath the crusted earth. The river's current slowed, then reversed for a time, carrying with it branches etched with runes no villager had carved. Birds returned, but they did not sing. They landed and rose atop rooftops, heads cocked, eyes fixed on the mountain. The children would not sleep, and when they did, they woke screaming of tunnels that breathed and roots that spoke and voices made of dripping water. On the 3rd morning, Halda summoned the elders to the ridge. They stood in the snow, cloaks wrapped tight, staring at the horizon where the ridgelines of Vetrador sloped like ancient jaws. There, against the sky, a new shape had risen, barely visible, but growing each day. A tower of stone, smooth and impossibly tall, where none had stood before. It was not built. It had surfaced. "It was buried," Halda said, voice low. "Now it reaches again." Irmla turned her blind eyes toward the shape. "The root hall. Heart of the woven. It stirs when blood remembers." "What does it seek?" asked one of the younger men, pale and afraid. Irmla did not answer. The question was too small. That night, Freydis dreamt, not of snow or fire, but of strings. She stood in a field of darkness, and all around her, thin threads stretched from the sky to the earth, from the mouths of sleepers to the stone beneath them, from the roots of trees to the hearts of men. Each thread hummed, and in each tone was a name. She saw her own name glowing faintly on one thread, frayed at the edges. Then, in the center of it all, the tower. Not of stone, but of thought, a beacon made from memory and despair, drawing the threads toward it like a spindle pulling wool. She woke with her axe in her hand. At dawn, she climbed alone to the ridge, cloaks snapping in the wind. The village watched her go but did not follow. She did not look back. She walked until the snow grew thin and the stone beneath took on the strange warmth of deep earth. At the edge of the cliff, she stopped. The tower was clearer now. No seams marked it. No doors, no windows. It rose straight and featureless, taller than any mountain she had ever seen, and above it the clouds churned in silence. She spoke once, her voice like flint. "If you are not done, then neither am I." The wind answered, not as sound, but as weight. Somewhere within the mountain, something began to turn. The woven were not broken. They were shifting. And the story had only begun to be told. The wind off the fjord changed with the season, but what carried across the water now was no mere weather. It was scent, of iron, wet root, and something fouler, like meat turned to rot beneath stone. The fishermen of the outer settlements along the glacial coast began to return early, their nets dragging up strange things from the deep, bones carved with holes like flutes, scales too large for any fish, and once, the head of a seal with eyes still blinking though no breath passed its lips. They said nothing to the Jarl. They burned what they caught and sealed their boats in tar and salt. But the sea did not forget. The tide began to hum, and the waves rose in unnatural rhythm, as if answering a beat beneath the earth. Far inland, in the village of Hrafsdal, where the cold sunk into bones and stayed through spring, two brothers trekked the slope toward the high pass that marked the end of known land. The older, Bjarn, was thick-necked and hard-eyed, his beard hung with frost. The younger, Alvar, carried a satchel of carved runes passed down from their grandmother, a Valva who had long warned of the woven. They had heard the tales of Rolf's vanished warband, of Freydis and the waking root, but they were hunters, not poets. Their journey had not been for glory or gold, but for truth, for what lay behind the mountain that now cast no shadow, even when the sun crawled low across the ice. The ascent was cruel, the rocks slick with meltwater and lined with markings that twisted the eyes when stared at too long. Alvar noticed them first, circular cuts in the cliffside, etched in patterns too smooth for blade or chisel. "These are not made," he said quietly. "They are grown." Bjarn grunted and pushed ahead, but the younger's words clung to the frost in his ears. At the summit, the wind died. No sound followed them past the crest, no bird, no howl, not even the whistle of snow against stone. The land beyond the ridge was not land at all but basin, a wide, flat bowl of earth that looked as though the gods had scooped it from the mountain with a thumb. And in its center stood the tower. Smooth, seamless, and tall as the great ash Yggdrasil was said to be, it did not belong to earth or sky. It pulsed with slow light, like breath rising from a sleeper, and around it spiraled patterns, concentric rings of stone and root, woven together in impossibly fine lattices that moved ever so slightly as they watched. Bjarn knelt and pressed his hand to the ground. It was warm. Beneath his palm, he felt the faint beat of something alive. Not beast. Not human. Something deeper. Alvar knelt beside him, pulled a rune from his pouch, and set it upon the soil. It hissed. A fine crack split the carved bone in two. He took another, this one marked for sight. He whispered an old chant, and the rune sparked faintly, casting a shimmer like sun upon water over his eyes. He saw the bindings. Beneath the surface, wrapped in soil and sinew, were chains, not iron, not forged, but grown. They threaded through the ground like veins, connecting not just to the tower but to everything around it. Trees. Stones. The sky. Even them. "We are in it," he said, voice low. "Inside the weave." Bjarn's jaw clenched. He stood and drew his blade, though against what he did not know. "If it sees us, it will come." But it did not come. Instead, the air shifted, and from the tower's base a door opened, no seen before, no mark. Just an absence where stone peeled itself aside. The interior was dark, not from shadow, but from depth. A darkness that drank thought. Alvar stepped forward, lips pale. "We must look." They entered together. Inside, the tower was not hollow. It was layered. Rings of walls moved as if breathing, the floor beneath them rippling with thin tendrils that recoiled at their steps. The scent was stronger here, soil and skin and something older. As they passed deeper within, they came upon a chamber where light pooled in the shape of a spiral, and in its center floated a figure. Not standing. Not kneeling. Suspended like seed in still water. It was a child. Its body was pale, translucent. Threads of root and vein coiled from its back into the walls around it. Its eyes were closed. Yet when Alvar stepped closer, it spoke, not aloud, but into the marrow of their bones. "Do not wake the Dreambinder. Not yet. She is listening still." Bjarn raised his blade. "What are you?" he asked, though his voice sounded distant in his own ears. "She grew us to remember. We are memory. Flesh used to shape forgetting." Alvar reached forward, touched the spiral of light. It recoiled. Behind them, the tower groaned. The walls shivered. A heartbeat, louder now, and then the child opened its eyes. The brothers fell to their knees, not from pain, but from gravity redefined. They were not falling, but descending, through time, through lineage. Visions split across their minds like ice cracking across a frozen lake. They saw the first woven, birthed not from wombs but from prayers, shaped from bark and smoke, servants of a mind older than Ymir's bones. They saw villages wrapped in sleep forever. Kings kneeling not in surrender, but in understanding. The roots that reached up from the mountain did not seek to conquer, but to tether, to pull everything back into the shape it once had, when all breath was one breath, all thought one will. Then the vision broke. Bjarn was on the floor, mouth filled with dust. Alvar wept, though no tears fell, only threads of white mist from his eyes. The child had vanished. The light was gone. Behind them, the entrance had closed. But not all was silent. A voice echoed from the walls, vast and slow. It was not the child. Not even the queen. It was the mountain. Thread by thread, the world is drawn. And now the pattern bends. They were released, not outside the tower, but at the base of the ridge. No memory of walking. No tracks in the snow. Behind them, the tower was no longer visible. Clouds had folded around it. Bjarn said nothing. Alvar clutched his runes, each one now cracked. And far below, in the settlements along the coast, the sea rose again, this time with voices in its foam. The sea moaned beneath a bruised sky, and along the ragged coast of the Norstrand, gulls wheeled silently in circles, their wings never beating, their shadows cast at impossible angles. The tides had turned strange. Salt no longer clung to the air as it once did, and where boats had once returned heavy with catch, now they returned empty, or not at all. Nets brought up bones knotted in hair, clumps of moss that whispered when touched, and once, a shield, rotted, waterlogged, and etched with the rune of the broken eye. The old fisher-folk wrapped it in iron chains and buried it beneath the black stones, but the dogs still whimpered and refused to go near. Some said the fjord had become a mouth, and the woven had begun to drink from it. Further inland, beneath the towering granite peaks of Ilsheim, where wind howled through cracks like a beast breathing in sleep, a traveler stood at the edge of the gorge known as the Stone Maw. She was cloaked in bearskin and layered in mail blackened by fire, her braids streaked with ash and bound with bone beads. Her name was not spoken by those who still valued the weight of words, for she had once been a thrall of the woven, kept not by chains but by thought. She had no memory of how she escaped, only that she awoke in a circle of burnt runes and clawed soil, and that her body bore marks no Sikhs could leave, raised lines beneath her flesh in the shape of vines and spirals, and a sigil over her heart that burned in moonlight. The skalds called her Skara, the severed, for it was said she had torn herself from the loom. Now she stood before the old pass where no man tread, where even wolves turned aside. The mouth of the gorge gaped wide, and within it the air was thick and unmoving, smelling of stone and something deeper, like memory left too long in the dark. Skara passed beneath the overhang without pause. The snow here had not settled properly in decades. It floated in eddies, then vanished entirely near the cliff face, drawn into cracks as if the mountain drank it. She followed no path, only the ache in her bones that pulsed whenever she neared the old lines of power. Her fingers brushed the rocks as she moved, and where she touched them, frost recoiled, leaving bare stone marked with spirals, some matching her scars exactly. At the gorge's heart lay the veiled pool, black and still, no wider than a hearth circle but deeper than any man could fathom. It was said to be the eye of the mountain, the place where the woven watched. Skara knelt beside it, and drew a blade across her palm. Blood dripped into the water and spread not outward, but downward, drawn in like breath. The pool rippled once. Then the surface split. From its depths rose a figure, not formed of flesh but of bark, bone, and woven mist. Its face bore no features, only a mask carved from root wood, ancient and smooth. Where its mouth should have been, light pulsed in patterns. Its arms extended slowly, and between its fingers grew cords, faint, silver, and humming. Threads of fate. Skara did not draw her blade. Instead, she raised her marked hand, and the sigil over her heart began to glow. "You carry the shard," the woven thing intoned, not in sound, but through the stone, vibrating the gorge walls. "I severed it," she replied, her voice harsh. "What was given is not owed." The thing tilted its head. A second figure emerged from the pool, then a third. Each was different, one tall and crowned with antlers, one thin as a reed, its limbs jointed backward, but each bore the same chords, the same presence. Together they moved in slow steps around her, weaving lines from the air into a pattern too vast to see. When they stopped, Skara stood in a circle of light. Her shadow vanished. "You are not outside the pattern," they said together. "You are its unraveling." She spat into the pool. "Then you should fear me." The air shifted. For the first time, the figures stilled. Behind them, the water began to churn. A shape rose, not a form, but a void, a hollow in the world shaped like a woman cloaked in roots and silence. No features, no limbs, only presence. The watchers knelt. "She comes," they whispered. Skara stepped back, but the light held her in place. From the void came a voice that was not voice, a pressure, an understanding pressed into the marrow of all things living. "You were made to be broken. Now you return to bind." Skara's mouth bled. Her scars lit like fire beneath her skin. She fell to one knee, teeth clenched, as visions poured through her, of the mountain's birth, of the first bindings when the gods fled the deep, of the long weaving that held the world from falling into madness. She saw herself, woven, unmade, remade. She saw others like her, scattered across the lands, dreamers and madmen, all marked by the loom. The void turned, and the figures dissolved. The pool sealed over, black and calm once more. Skara rose, shaking down on the cliff above the gorge. 3 ravens circled. One bore a missing eye. One bore a wound in its side. The third bore nothing but silence. Skara looked to the north, where the tower had risen beyond Vetrador. Her blood knew its pull. The pattern had shifted. The mountain was stirring again, not as a beast, but as a mind. Thought had returned to stone. And she, once torn free, had been called back not to destroy, but to choose. The snow began to fall again, soft and wrong. The wind carried no chill, only the scent of soil, and from somewhere behind the veil of the sky, something old watched and waited. The loom was tightening. And somewhere across the sea, old runes burned in the roots of Yggdrasil itself. The long dark had settled deep across the land, and the sun rose no higher than a blade's length above the horizon before sinking again into the bruise-colored sky. Ice coated the fjord like a lid upon a tomb, and even the seals that once haunted the shores had vanished beneath it. The people of Eldervac moved more slowly now, as if time itself had thickened. Shadows lingered where they should not. Fires burned low no matter the fuel, and dreams grew heavier with each night. Few spoke, and those who did whispered only of the tower, the black spire that pulsed faintly in the north like a beacon lit from within the bones of the world. It had become larger with each passing day, not by growth, but by perception, as though the land itself were leaning toward it. Friedis had not slept in 3 nights. Her eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with salt, but her grip remained steady upon the haft of her axe, which she now bound with sinew dyed in the juice of ash root. She moved like a wraith between the longhouses, her boots dragging grooves into the frost. Cole watched her from the hall's threshold, silent as ever, though the scar at his throat now shimmered faintly even by daylight. Something within him had begun to awaken again, not the bond, but the echo of its memory. When he moved, the dogs flinched. When he spoke, the wind changed. On the morning of the 6th day, an omen came. A stag appeared at the edge of the village, massive, with antlers like twisted trees and eyes glazed white as river ice. It did not move, only watched, its breath clouding the air. Then it opened its mouth, and from within came not a call, but a sound like water retreating from shore. Blood ran from its hooves. It collapsed, and its body crumbled not into flesh but into soil. The villagers stood in silence, none daring to touch the earth where it had fallen. Friedis knelt beside it, and whispered a single word. Bound! That night, the seer Irmla came down from the high rocks for the first time since the mist-shrouded battle. She wore no furs despite the cold, only a cloak of woven reeds and raven feathers. Her eyes were fully milked now, but her steps found their way without falter. She stood before the broken ring of stone where the queen's crown still rested, untouched and glistening with frost. She laid a single carved jawbone beside it and knelt. "She is not gone," she murmured, She has only scattered. What was many is again one, but not in form. In will. Friday stood before her. What does she seek? Irmla looked past her, toward the north. Completion. The pattern nears its final shape. The strands you severed must be rewoven. Or unraveled fully. And if we do neither? Then the world becomes still. Friday turned to Cole. He stood now just beyond the old well, where the ground had begun to sink slightly, as though something beneath stirred in its sleep. The snow around him melted in a perfect ring. His breath did not fog. He met her gaze. She calls, he said. At once, the ravens took flight from the rooftops, dozens of them, shrieking as they rose in spirals toward the broken moon. The dogs began to howl. The trees groaned, though there was no wind. And from the distant slopes of Vetrador, a new sound rolled, a rhythm not made by drums or footfall, but by countless voices whispering in unison. They were not words. They were threads. Friedis gathered her blade and cloak, and the villagers watched as she passed through them. No one followed. Not even Halder, who stood at the longhouse doors with one hand clenched around a ring of old iron keys. They knew this path now belonged to her alone. She climbed without sleep, without food, without pause. The snows rose in sheets around her, veiling the world, yet she moved as if led. The mountain greeted her with silence, and the trees bent slightly as she passed. When she reached the upper ridge where the stone men of the old age stood guard, massive statues carved by forgotten hands, she found them changed. Their faces, once stern and eyeless, now bore symbols where eyes should be. Runes of sight, carved freshly in weeping black sap. She touched one, and the sky above her flickered as though something massive had just blinked. Beyond the ridge, the land had altered. The basin where once the tower had stood solitary was now lined with concentric trenches, each filled with dark water that did not freeze. Bridges of root and stone crossed them, and at the center, the tower breathed. Its surface was no longer smooth. It rippled slowly, as if sheathing some giant heart, and from its summit rose threads, hundreds of them, silver and thin, reaching up into the heavens where the stars had begun to drift apart. Friedis crossed the trenches. At each bridge, her steps summoned visions, faces she had known, places she had passed, her mother's voice humming in the dark. The threads brushed against her, but did not bind. They moved around her, hesitant. When she reached the base of the tower, a door opened once more, not with noise, but with absence, folding space like cloth pulled tight. Inside, the walls hummed. The runes from her dreams floated in the air, rearranging endlessly, never forming words. And there, at the heart of the chamber, lay a cradle. Not for child, but for soul. Within it, coiled in roots and glimmering wet threads, rested the second crown. This one was not antlered. It was made of woven hair, feather, ash, and bone. As Friedis stepped closer, it lifted slightly, suspended by breath alone. Her axe dimmed. Her pulse slowed. A voice came from behind her. You were not born to fight it. You were born to hold it. She turned. Cole stood in the doorway. His eyes were wholly white now, but they wept. I remember, he said. I remember the loom. I remember her. Friedis looked again at the crown. She waits, Cole whispered. But she is no longer many. Friedis reached forward. The threads parted. The cradle opened. The moment her fingers touched the crown, the tower sang. Not with sound, but with the world. And every woven across the land turned toward it, eyes wide, mouths open. The weaver had returned. And the binding would begin anew, or be broken forever. The song of the tower did not end. It pulsed in waves that passed through stone and sky alike, a resonance that throbbed beneath the skin of the world. Snow stopped falling. Clouds thinned and scattered like frightened crows. Far to the east, in the ironwood groves where no sun had touched for a generation, the wolves howled in unison and would not stop. In distant meadows, unborn calves bled in the womb, and moss peeled itself from the rocks. The sea trembled in its basin. The runes carved into grave markers flickered with faint light, and in the hollows where no wind ever stirred, voices began to whisper to the bones. Friday stood at the foot of the cradle, the crown of hair and ash and bones still in her hands. Threads dangled from it, trembling. Some pulled toward her, others writhed as if resisting. Cole knelt beside the door, hands clasped over his eyes, his mouth moving in silence. The light from the tower dimmed now, drawn inward toward the cradle's center, as if the crown consumed it. The room had narrowed, the walls pulling close without moving, space folding inward as if the mountain had turned its gaze fully upon her. The cold was no longer the bite of winter. It was the chill of thought long buried. She did not place the crown on her head. She carried it out through the tower's inner gate, across the trench bridges where still water now rippled with a rhythm like breath. The ravens circled above her. The sky bled light that was neither dawn nor dusk. The land below the tower's basin had changed, subtly at first, lines in the earth curving where they once lay straight, the grain of rock bending like wood under weight. Shapes moved in the snow without form, and where they passed, the frost melted in symbols. When she reached the ridgeline once more, the wind had ceased entirely. A silence had begun to root in the world. At the base of the ridge, the people of Eldavak waited. They had not gathered by word or call, but had come nonetheless, drawn by the same rhythm that had stirred the old trees into groaning and the old stones into singing. Children stood beside their mothers, wide-eyed and pale. Warriors clutched spears that vibrated faintly in their hands. Even Halder, whose face had been carved by war and weather alike, stood without command, his eyes fixed upon Fridas as she emerged from the mist with the crown held before her. None approached. She did not speak. Irmla stepped forward last. Her bones creaked beneath her reed cloak, but her steps were certain. She placed one hand upon the earth. Beneath her palm, the ground pulsed. "You carry the seed," she said, her blind eyes cast skyward. "Now you must choose what it will become." Fridas looked at the villagers, then to Cole, whose skin glowed faintly like bark after fire. She turned her gaze to the north, to the places beyond the fjord where the dead did not sleep. The mountain loomed behind her. The tower had ceased its song. In the stillness that followed, the world seemed to tilt. From the east came a new shape. A war band, but not of men. They moved over the frozen river, dozens of them, clad in armor formed from woven bark and bronze, their helms grown with root antlers and carved with glyphs from before the age of men. Their faces were not covered. Their eyes were hollow sockets filled with dim light. Each carried a weapon shaped from the mountain itself, stone and bone, bark and tendon. They moved without sound, their footfalls leaving no mark. Among them walked a single figure, taller than the rest, cloaked in black roots that dragged behind it like a funeral train. Its face bore no mouth, only a vertical slit from crown to chin, through which glowed the light of the loom. The villagers did not run. Fridas stepped forward, the crown in her hands. The ground beneath her feet cracked. The root men halted. The tall one stepped ahead of the others, raising its hand in silent greeting. It pointed at the crown. She lifted it. The sky pulsed once. From the base of the mountain, the earth split. A second tower rose, this one thinner, darker, more jagged. Not smooth, not whole. It rose like a bone from a wound, tearing the clouds as it climbed. The wind returned then, howling down from the north in a single, sustained scream. The crown in Freydis's hands twisted. The threads pulled taut. Light spilled from between her fingers. The warband knelt, heads bowed. The tall figure spoke, not with voice, but with presence. "She who bore the thorn returns." Fridas did not bow. She turned and looked at the villagers, her people, still unmoving. Then, without a word, she placed the crown upon the ground. The threads recoiled. The roots shuddered. The wind ceased again. The figure extended its arms. From its chest, a third thread unfurled, this one red as blood and glowing with pulses that beat in rhythm with Freydis's own. Cole stepped beside her. He reached for the thread. She caught his hand. The ground shook. Somewhere beneath the ice, something screamed, not in pain, but in awakening. The root men stood. The threads lifted from the crown and began to writhe, weaving themselves anew into a shape not seen since the old age. And Fridas, her fingers still red from the cradle's warmth, took the crown once more. She did not place it on her head. She placed it on Cole's. The wind died. The sky split. The looms sang once more. And the woven bent their knees. The threads did not fall. They hung motionless in the air like silver frost frozen mid-drift, quivering faintly as though listening for a song yet unsung. The crown upon Cole's head did not rest. It floated, suspended just above his brow, the threads piercing the sky and anchoring to a place no eye could see. His gaze, once soft with the burden of half-lost childhood, had turned inward. Where before there was memory, now there was motion, patterns etched not across his face, but through his very breath. Behind him, the earth pulsed once, and again, then stilled. It was not death. It was waiting. Fridas stepped back, slow as the tide drawing from a shore where something sacred had just landed. Her hands trembled though she bore no fear. All warmth had left her fingers, replaced by the feeling of moss underfoot and the heaviness of old blood. Around her, the woven rose. The tall figure with the root-draped cloak lowered its arms and turned its face toward Cole, though it possessed no eyes. Still it saw. And as it saw, it bowed, not with servitude, but with recognition. In the village, the people of Eldavac had dropped to their knees, one by one, not from reverence but from gravity shifted. The sky had cracked just once, a sound like a glacier snapping in the belly of the world, and now nothing quite sat where it had before. The longhouse leaned slightly eastward though no wind pressed it. Water in the wells no longer reflected the sky. Even the trees creaked out of rhythm. The old laws had not broken. They had been rewritten. Halder remained standing though barely. His hand was clenched upon his old spear, its haft carved with the name of his father's father. The runes upon it, long faded and ceremonial, now glowed dimly as if remembering their purpose. He looked not to Cole, but to Fridas, and when he spoke, it was with the sorrow of a man who knew stories did not always end in fire or steel. "He has been claimed," he said. "But not lost." Fridas nodded once, her jaw set like stone. "He carries the wound. But he remembers the blade." Cole did not speak. Instead, he raised one hand, and with it the threads lifted higher, twisting as they rose. Above them, the clouds thinned to gauze, revealing no stars, only depth, a pale whirlpool sky that turned in silence, wide and endless. From that yawning sky, shapes began to form, not bodies, but suggestions of thought, arrangements of glint and curve and pale color that moved like runes written on smoke. One hovered just above the crown. It began to spin. From across the basin came a howl, not wolf, but deeper, like the yawning cry of a mountain breathing for the first time in an age. The ice across the fjord cracked in long, jagged lines. Fissures appeared in the hills. A tree uprooted itself without sound and lay sideways, its roots curled in submission. The tower behind them began to sink, not fall, not crumble, but fold downward into the stone, returning without scar to the wound from which it had risen. Cole turned his head slowly toward the east. His eyes glowed with the faint pulse of fireflies, and his mouth moved, though his voice came not from throat but from the wind itself. When he spoke, it was with many tones, layered and slow, like voices echoing across stone chambers in the deep earth. "Others stir." The woven shifted uneasily. The tall figure stepped forward, tilting its mask toward Fridas. "The threadbearer awakens them," it said. "The pattern is unsealed." Fridas looked from Cole to the roots twisting across the snow. "Then there are more." "Some buried," the figure replied. "Some sleeping. Some dreaming of escape." "And if they rise?" she asked. "They will bind what was not meant to bend," the woven said. "They will twist the loom until all breath moves with one rhythm." Cole raised both hands, and from his palms emerged rings, light, invisible, save for their motion, like ripples in breath. They spread outward, passing through rock, soil, bone, flesh. No pain followed. But those struck felt it, the memory of origin. A glimpse, brief and shattering, of a world before fear. Irmla collapsed to her knees, her mouth open in awe. "He reaches the root of the root," she whispered. "He speaks not as man, but as what men once were before the world grew loud." At the edge of the crowd, a young girl stepped forward. Her hair was bound in ice thread, and her hands held a small wooden doll carved with the face of a god whose name had been forgotten. She approached Cole, untouched by fear. The threads bent to allow her, and she stood beneath the weight of the crown, staring up into his burning eyes. "Are you a god?" she asked. Cole looked down slowly. His mouth moved, and this time the words came through air. "No," he said. "I am the knot between." The girl placed her doll at his feet and stepped back into the crowd. Friedis turned then to the north, to where the ridges of Vetror had shifted. A new light burned faintly in the mountain's folds, a red glow, low and flickering like embers beneath ice. It pulsed once. Then again. She looked to Halder. "Another has risen," she said. Halder nodded grimly. "The pattern spreads." The woven began to turn, each vanishing one by one into the cracks of the land, pulled not by will, but by design. The tall figure lingered. "The bearer may hold the loom," it said to Friedis. But the threads still wore with each other. Cole closed his eyes, and the tower's last stones sank into silence. The threads shimmered and vanished. The crown floated no longer. It settled gently upon his brow. And the world held its breath. The red glow in the mountain's ribs did not fade with daybreak. It pulsed from deep within the granite flesh of Vetror, as if some old vein had been struck and now bled slowly into the sky. The light was not fire. It did not flicker, but throbbed in rhythm with something buried far beneath. The same rhythm the woven had answered, the same cadence the threads once moved to before they were cut. In the high passes where no moss grew and even the bones of crows froze hollow, stones had begun to hum. The hunters of the far fjords spoke of trees that bled sap without cause and frost that formed words on their shields while they slept. Some fled south. Others stayed, sharpening old blades against older fear. Far below, in the valley of Eldervac, the silence after the crown's descent stretched long. No bird called. No dog barked. The threads had vanished, but their memory lingered in the air like mist that would not lift. Cole remained at the center of the hollow where the tower had once loomed. The earth there no longer accepted footprints. Snow melted before it touched the ring. The crown sat light upon his brow, as if made of breath. His skin had grown pale and smooth, unmarred by cold or wind, and his eyes no longer blinked in rhythm with life. He stood not like a boy, but like a rune carved into the shape of one. Around him, those who had gathered slowly withdrew, not with fear, but reverence. Something had changed. He was no longer kin, nor enemy. He was the knot, the pause, the breathe between threads. Friedis watched him from a distance, cloak drawn close. She did not speak. Halder stood beside her, spear planted in frost. Behind them, the villagers waited at the tree line, uncertain whether to bow or run. Irmla sat upon a flat stone, her fingers wrapped in thin cords of gut as she traced shapes in the snow. One by one, the shapes refused to stay still. They shifted when no hand touched them. She wiped them away with a trembling palm. "He is not bound," she whispered, more to herself than the others. "He has become the binding." Friedis stepped forward once. Cole did not move. His eyes followed the red glow above. "He sees the tower beneath," she said. "The one not raised but buried." "Another loom," Halder murmured. "Or its echo." They descended at dusk, when the glow had spread across the mountain like veins through old ice. The path wound higher, away from the ridge where the first tower had stood. This slope had no name. No trails wound through it, and the maps of skalds and seafarers marked it only with dark lines and warnings. It was said to be the spine of an ancient beast, the place where the gods once stood to carve the rivers with their blades. Even the air changed as they climbed, growing thick and slow, not from cold but from age. Snow hung in the air longer than it should, and when it fell, it made no sound. They reached the shoulder of the peak by moonrise. The glow now rose from a great crack in the stone, jagged and wide, as if something beneath had wrenched itself upward and the mountain had failed to contain it. The stone around the fissure was blackened but not burned. It pulsed like a living wound. And from it rose a low, rhythmic chant, not sung by voice, but by the mountain itself. The words were not of this age. Not spoken, but remembered. Friedis placed her hand upon the edge of the rift. The chant passed through her bones like marrow turned to water. She turned to Halder. "It wakes," she said. He nodded. "And it remembers the loom." As if summoned, the wind rose. But it carried no scent of pine or frost. It smelled of root and old blood, of halls sealed by time and stone where breath had not passed for 1,000 winters. Then came the sound, not thunder, not quake, but movement. From within the crack, something shifted. Stone groaned. A tremor passed through the ridge. And then, faint but clear, a whisper shaped by breath. "He wears the crown." Cole stepped into the rift. No one called to stop him. No hand reached. No blade lifted. He moved as if drawn, not by compulsion but by return. The stone parted where his feet passed, folding like cloth soaked in night. The chant deepened. The rift widened. And the mountain opened. Not into cave or passage, but into memory. They followed. The path led not downward but inward, into a hall not built but grown. Roots coiled along the walls, petrified in shapes like the bones of serpents. Columns of stone bore the patterns of great threads, twisting, weaving, sometimes bound, sometimes severed. The air was thick with silence, but beneath it ran sound, low and endless, like voices speaking in a language just beyond reach. They passed alcoves where figures knelt in shadow, wrapped in bark and wrapped in time. Eyes opened in the dark as they moved past. None spoke. At the heart of the hall stood a second cradle. This one was vast, shaped not for a child, nor for a crown, but for a world. Cole walked to its edge. The glow from the mountain's heart cast his form in silhouette, and the crown upon his head shimmered with every breath. The threads returned, visible now only in reflections, in the glint of wet stone, in the way Freydis's own shadow stretched without source. They gathered at the cradle's edge. Cole spoke once. "It is not a tower. It is a root." The walls responded. They did not shake, nor fall, nor cry. They listened. And then they grew. The cradle beneath the mountain pulsed with rhythm not born of flesh, but of stone remembering how to breathe. Threads reached outward, groping through the dim like roots seeking water, and wherever they touched, the walls shifted, taking on the shapes of memory. There were no torches, yet the chamber glowed with a soft radiance that moved like thought. Faces emerged briefly from the stone, faces of ancestors long forgotten, their features weathered into eternal grimace. They wept without tears and watched without judgment. The root that was not a tower had begun to awaken, and as it grew, it pressed against the shape of the world. Cole stood at the edge of it all, motionless, the crown fixed upon his head like frost etched into bone. His eyes had gone colorless, filled with drifting flecks of light, and in his presence, the chamber did not echo. He raised one hand and spoke no word, but the threads responded, tightening, coiling around the cradle, forming patterns too vast to be known by mortal tongue. His body remained that of a boy, but the air bent around him, and the runes on his skin had deepened, branching down his neck and across his chest like veins carved in glass. He no longer belonged to the realm of men. Freydis stood behind him, her axe slung low, her cloak damp with frost that had not fallen from any sky. Her breath came slow, controlled, though she tasted the air like blood in her mouth. Beside her, Halder kept his spear pressed to the floor, the tip humming faintly against the stone as if drawing heat from memory. Neither spoke. Words had become smaller here. From the far end of the hall came a sound, slow and dragging, as if something too large for flesh moved against the grain of time. The walls split open like cracked bark, and from it emerged a procession. Figures, 10 in all, each cloaked in layered hides and hair, their heads crowned with rings of woven horn and teeth. Their faces were hidden behind masks shaped from the skulls of vanished beasts. They walked in silence, bearing no weapons, and each step they took sent a ripple through the root's surface, as though the mountain itself listened to their gait. These were the Eldbinders, the keepers of the deep pattern, and their presence had not been felt since the dawn of the second weave. They passed no judgment and bore no allegiance. They were neither woven nor wholly free. They were the eyes of the loom. They formed a circle around Cole and waited. The boy turned slowly to face them. When he spoke, his voice echoed not from his lips but from the cracks in the stone. This was meant to remain buried. One of the Eldbinders stepped forward, its mask carved in the shape of a bird with many wings. Yet it calls to you. Another, whose mask bore the twisting horns of an elk, added, You wear what should not return. Cole nodded once. The crown shows. I only carry its weight. The pattern recoils, said the third, whose face was covered in copper scales. It tightens. It seeks to complete itself. Friday stepped forward, her boots striking the floor with the sound of bone. What lies beneath this cradle? All 10 turned to her. The air grew heavier, as if she had spoken a word that was meant to sleep. The first root, they said in unison. The song that shaped the other songs. The beginning and the knot. Cole turned back to the cradle. The threads had stopped moving. The walls trembled. It stirs. The elk-masked figure tilted its head. And will you bind it again? Cole reached down and pressed his palm to the cradle's surface. Light shot through the root, pulsing in waves of memory, visions not of battle, but of weaving. Countless figures working in silence, shaping fate through thread and ash, through wound and whisper. Villages drawn whole from the loom. Wars prevented before they began. But then, the shattering. The sundering of threads. The rise of separate will. The loom left in pieces beneath the skin of the world. I do not know if it can be bound, Cole whispered. But I can hear its breath. Behind him, the air cracked. A fissure opened in the root, and from within came a sound, deep and slow, like the first breath of a creature waking after an age of burial. The wind that followed was not cold. It was warm and thick, filled with scent, ancient moss, broken stone, the rot of fallen trees. It coiled through the hall, stirring cloaks and ash, curling into ears and lungs. Fridas fell to one knee, pressing her hand to the floor to steady herself. Halder groaned and dropped his spear. The wood splintered on impact. Cole stood alone. The roots split wider. And from within rose a shape. It did not walk. It grew. A figure, tall and genderless, formed from bark, ash, and smoke. Its face was a mask of living wood, its eyes blank hollows filled with a drifting golden light. Its limbs were wrapped in long, coiling strands of hair and vine. And at its core, where a heart might be, pulsed the shape of the eye, thorn-ringed, cracked, and glowing faintly like embers within snow. It looked at Cole. And then it spoke. Threadbearer. You are either god nor beast. You are the question left unanswered. Cole did not kneel. He raised his hand, and the threads returned, coiling around his wrist and into the air like veins reaching back toward their source. I come not to bind, he said, his voice steady. I come to choose. The root being tilted its head. Then choose. The chamber filled with light. Not fire. Not lightning. But understanding. And far above, in the outer world, every raven turned east. The loom had opened its eye. The wind that poured from the cradle was not air but thought, old and endless, loosed from the dark where the root being had slumbered. It carried no sound, yet it howled in the minds of those present, long, wordless murmurs laced with memory not their own. Time bent within the chamber. Snow that had settled on cloaks turned to ash, then to water, then to mist, and finally drifted upward as though gravity had changed its mind. The Eldbinders stood unmoving in their ring, their masks trembling ever so slightly as the light of the eye burned brighter at the center of the root being's chest. All eyes were fixed upon Cole, the crowned boy whose breath now matched the cadence of the mountain. He stood calm as still water before the form that had neither age nor end, whose limbs crackled with slow growth, and whose voice wove itself from the silence between all things spoken. Fridas remained kneeling, her hands still to the earth, knuckles white, her pulse a drum against the cold stone. The root being turned its faceless mask toward her, and in its presence, even the marrow in her bones seemed to remember being dust. Threads slid from its fingertips like the shed skins of stars, reaching toward Cole without haste or hunger, simply waiting. The air around them thickened, full of unseen motion. Beneath their feet, the cradle pulsed, once, twice, then stilled, as if listening. The voice returned, speaking not with words but with shape and pressure, pressing thought into the skulls of all who stood near. There was a time before time, when all was bound. Flesh and will, tree and stone. No choice, no fracture. Then came the cutters. They severed the song and called it freedom. Cole's gaze never wavered. And now you seek to unsever it. The root being inclined its head, a slow gesture that rustled its cloak of vine and bark. The world forgets. But the loom remembers. The root remembers. Another thread rose, twining through the air like smoke over still water. It hovered before Cole's chest, where the light from his crown pulsed steadily. His arms did not move, but the air around his hands tightened, and the thread curled inward as if answering command. Fridas rose. Her voice was low, but the roots beneath her feet stirred when she spoke. And what of will? What of the choosing? The being turned toward her. There is no will where nothing is remembered. Memory is the shape of choice. You ask for fire, yet fear its warmth. The Eldbinder with the bird mask shifted at last. It stepped forward and raised a thin staff carved from whitewood twisted into a spiral. He holds the crown, it said aloud, its voice echoing strangely. He holds the loom's heart. Cole's fingers twitched. The thread before him caught fire without flame, burning not with heat but with memory. Faces rose within it, his, Fradis's, the antlered queen, Halda's ancestors, the child from the fjord whose voice had vanished into the ice. The thread spun faster. The root being stepped forward, towering over the boy. Will you finish the weave? Cole looked to Fridas. She met his gaze. You know what I would do? He nodded. And then he let go. The thread fell. It struck the cradle and split into strands, 7, then 70, then uncountable filaments that wrapped the chamber in light. The root being recoiled, arms outstretched, vines shrieking across the stone. The Eldbinders staggered back, their masks cracking. The hall trembled. Walls shifted. A great groan echoed from deep below, not of collapse but of resistance. Cole raised both arms. From his hands poured not threads, but roots, pure, gold-veined, glowing with the light of a memory older than the woven. They moved like rivers in air, coiling toward the cradle, binding the eye, wrapping the root being in a weave too fast to see. It screamed, not with fear, but with loss. What are you doing? Cole's voice rang clear. I choose. The light flared. The root being buckled. Not to bind, Cole said, but to divide. The crown burst into shards of light. Each flew into the air like a star torn from a constellation and disappeared into the stone, the earth, the breath of those who watched. The weave unraveled. The root being cracked down the center. The eye faded. And the loom fell silent. A long silence followed. One by one, the Eldbinders collapsed. The chamber returned to shadow. The root being's form fell forward, striking the cradle with a sound like thunder muffled by centuries. Its body shattered, not into dust, but into seeds. Small, black, smooth. They scattered across the stone like teeth. Fridas caught Cole as he staggered. The light had left his eyes. His skin was pale, almost gray. He was not broken but spent. Whatever thread had passed through him was gone now, and only the boy remained. Halda approached, slowly, and knelt beside them. What did he do? He asked. Fridas answered without looking up. He made a third way. Above them, the ceiling cracked open. Snow began to fall into the hall. Not the thick, dry flakes of winter, but soft, slow specks that shimmered with light. They melted before they landed. The cradle, once the womb of the root's memory, faded from view as if never there. The mountain stilled. Far beyond, in the valleys and fjords, the woven who had not returned to stone felt the pulse cease. Some wept. Others screamed. A few simply fell and were never seen again. The bond had been cut. Not undone, but remade. Each root now separate. Each will, now free to remember or to forget. In the darkness of the cradle hall, Cole stirred and whispered, "It is done!" And for the first time in an age, the mountain sighed. The snow that fell from the cleft above did not gather. It touched the stone and vanished, not melted, not scattered, but erased, as though it had never been. In the silence that followed the unweaving, nothing stirred. Even time itself seemed reluctant to move forward. The hall that had once held the cradle of memory now lay emptied of light, the roots brittle, the runes dulled. The air had lost its pressure, and with it, the sense of being watched by something ancient and unblinking. Only the seeds remained, dark, small, and gleaming faintly where they had rolled into the hollows between the stones. The root being was no more. The threads had withdrawn. And Cole, bearer of the crown, lay pale and unmoving in Freydis's arms, the last of the moonlight dimming in the hollow of his throat. Outside, dawn arrived in strange silence. The red glow that had once painted the peak faded into the iron sky, and a mist rolled down from the slopes that did not move like air but crept, low and searching, as if seeking something that had slipped from its grasp. The ravens had stopped circling. They now lined the ridge like sentries, unmoving, each with its head tilted toward the cradle hall, their black eyes glinting with quiet dread. Freydis rose with Cole in her arms. Her boots slipped on the frost-slick stone, but she did not fall. Halder followed behind, his steps heavy, the haft of his shattered spear dragging in the dust like the limb of a wounded beast. The Eldbinders did not rise. Their bodies remained collapsed at the edge of the cradle, their masks cracked and dark, as though they had poured the last of their being into the judgment they had failed to deliver. The hall no longer hummed. The mountain, once alive with breath and blood and pulse, had grown still. They emerged into gray light. Wind swept across the high ridge, lifting steam from their cloaks. The snowfields below had shifted, no longer flat, but scored with long, curling patterns that spiraled outward from the mountain's crown like the wake of something vast moving beneath. In the far distance, where the fjord kissed the sea, black shapes moved through the mist. Ships. Or bones of ships. Or memories of what once sailed beneath forgotten stars. No sail flew. No oars dipped. They drifted against the wind. Cole stirred. It was only the smallest motion, a twitch of fingers, a catch in his breath, but Freydis froze as if he had spoken. She knelt quickly and pressed her ear to his chest. The heartbeat was faint. Slower than a man's. Slower even than a tree's. But it was there. A rhythm no longer tied to the cradle or the root, but to something else. Something new. Halder watched in silence. Then, without a word, he knelt beside them and pressed his weathered palm to the frozen earth. His eyes closed. He muttered an old prayer, not to Odin, not to Freya, not even to the gods of the deep who ruled the mist, but to the nameless ones who dwelled in the world before words. The prayer carried no request. Only thanks. And warning. Below, in the village of Eldervak, the people had begun to gather at the old stone ring where once the queen had fallen. They came not in fear, nor hope, but in stillness. They carried no weapons. Their children stood in silence beside them. Even the hounds, sensitive to the tremors beneath the skin of the world, crouched low and waited. For what, they could not say. But all knew that the silence meant change. As the three figures descended the mountain path, Freydis with Cole in her arms, Halder behind them like a shadow grown long, the wind began to rise once more. Not harsh. Not biting. But full of breath. The kind of wind that carried scent from lands unseen, the kind that stirred dreams from slumber. The villagers looked up. Many fell to their knees. Others wept without knowing why. Irmla emerged from her hut on the edge of the stone yard, her cloak dragging behind her like roots unearthed. Her blind eyes turned to the ridge. A smile crept across her wrinkled face, not of joy, but of confirmation. She turned her face to the wind and spoke only once. "It has begun again." Freydis crossed into the ring. She laid coal upon the stones where the moonlight had first touched the earth. He did not wake. But his breath came steady, and the color had returned faintly to his lips. Around them, the villagers pressed inward. None dared cross the boundary of the ring. It glowed faintly now, etched with threads invisible to the eye but felt in the bones. Then, from the east came the sound. A single drumbeat. Not made by hand or skin. A pulse from the earth. Then another. And another. The rhythm returned, but it was no longer the rhythm of the woven. It was different, rougher, fractured, unfinished. A song yet to be composed. The mountain exhaled. The seeds in the cradle hall cracked open. And in every corner of the north, in every forest, fjord, and forgotten ruin, something stirred. Not bound. Not free. But choosing. The mist returned before the next moonrise, sliding over the mountains like a burial shroud. It did not roll or sweep, but crawled, slow and deliberate, as though alive. It filled the clefts and hollow paths of Vetrador and slithered down toward the lowlands, winding between tree roots and the blackened stones of ruined shrines. Its presence brought no chill, only silence, thick, muffling silence that pressed against the skull and turned breath into labor. Ravens vanished from the sky. Wolves stopped howling. Even the streams slowed, their waters dragging over rock like blood through stiffened veins. Only the seeds whispered now, scattered across the earth, pulsing faintly in the dark, unseen. In Eldervac, fires were not lit. The people waited. Freydis sat at Cole's side, her eyes never closing, her thoughts shaped only by the rhythm of his breath. Each exhale came like a sign, though she knew not of what. His skin had warmed. Color had returned to his lips. But he had not stirred again. He was neither sleeping nor waking. He was between. Halder stood watch at the edge of the stone ring, his axe planted in the frost, his breath fogging before him like the last smoke of a dying hearth. The villagers did not ask questions. They merely waited, as if by unspoken oath. At the edge of the fjord, where salt water met the mountain's foot, something moved beneath the tide. The fishermen had long since hauled their boats ashore and lashed them against the pine posts, but the ropes now strained, pulled not by storm or current, but by something deeper, an undercurrent of will. None dared venture down to see. Beneath the black surface of the water, strange shapes turned slowly, as if circling a memory not their own. In the higher places, among the cliffside forests and wind-scoured ridges, the old paths had begun to unravel. Stones marked by ancestral hands were found overturned, their runes cracked or rearranged. Trees twisted their limbs into knots that resembled symbols, spirals, claws, and the thorn rings of the loom's eye. A goat-herder from the far valley returned wide-eyed and pale, swearing that he had seen a woman made of roots standing atop a cairn, her arms outstretched to the sky, her face hidden by a mask woven from hair. He did not sleep again. Nor did he speak further. Deep beneath the earth, in the halls where the woven had once gathered, the last of their kind stirred from stone. The unraveling had come and gone, but some fragments lingered, tethered not by the old weave, but by their refusal to forget. They rose now not as servants but as remnants, half-formed and dreamless. One crawled through a vent in the stone, its hands raw and bloodless, dragging itself toward a shaft of moonlight that spilled through a crack above. Its face bore no mouth. Only runes that flickered as it gasped for breath. Far to the north, where the mountains bled into the icefields and the sun touched the horizon only briefly before fleeing again, the hunters of the frost tribes found something buried beneath a glacier, a great horn of black bone, curved and split, its hollow mouth still echoing with sound though no breath had touched it in generations. One of the hunters placed his hand upon it. He did not move again. His companions dragged him away, but he remained stiff, eyes wide, throat humming with voices he had not spoken. That night their campfire froze from within. In Eldervac, the mist thickened. Freydis did not rise. Cole's chest continued to lift and fall, but now his eyes fluttered beneath closed lids. The villagers began to gather again, not in fear but in instinct. Something in their blood called them to the stone ring. Even the old and the maimed came, hobbling on splintered limbs, eyes hollow and gleaming. They brought no offerings. Only presents. Even silence can be sacred. Then, as if drawn by a hidden thread, Irmla stepped into the ring. The old woman's eyes were covered by woven cloth, but she walked as though led by stars. She knelt beside Cole and reached into the folds of her robe. From within, she drew a seed, dark, smooth, and glowing faintly like coal in ash. She placed it on Cole's chest. "It is not finished," she said. "He has cracked the world, but not planted the new." Fridas whispered. "What will it become?" Irmla did not answer. Her blind eyes turned to the sky, where no stars shone, and her lips moved with words too old to carry sound. Cole's body tensed. A tremor passed through the ring. The seed on his chest pulsed once, then split. From within, a single thread uncoiled, thinner than hair, bright as frost under moonlight. It hovered above him, then moved, slowly, toward the center of the ring, where the loom light had once burned. The thread stopped there, suspended in air, unmoving. Then, it began to hum. Low at first, then louder. Then joined by a second sound, Cole's voice. His eyes opened. He sat upright, breath ragged, face wet with cold sweat. The villagers gasped but did not move. "I saw it," he whispered. Fridas stepped forward. "Saw what?" "The root still grows." His hands shook. He looked to the thread, now twisting slowly in place, alive with pale fire. "It remembers me." Irmla nodded. "It is waiting." "For what?" Halda asked. Cole turned his eyes to the mist-shrouded fjord. "For us to speak back." And then, far off, beyond the ridges and across the black water, a horn sounded. But it was no war horn. It was older. Calling not to armies, but to memory. The horn's echo rolled across the fjord like thunder broken into pieces, winding through the mists and stirring the black waters from their stillness. It was not a sound of alarm nor of welcome, but something in between, a call assured not to ears but to blood. It carried the tone of roots cracking beneath ice, of bones stirring beneath centuries of silence. In Eldervac, every soul froze. The children's mouths parted in unknowing awe. The elders dropped to their knees. Even the hounds whimpered low and turned their eyes toward the hills. No one could name the source of the sound, but all understood it. It was not new. It had been waiting. Cole stood without effort, as though pulled upright by the very thread of breath. His eyes were rimmed with shadow, but within them burned the pale silver of the seed's light. The thread that had uncoiled from the cracked seed now floated above his shoulder, gently circling him like a living rune, slow and weightless. His voice was thin, but each word seemed to strike the frost like a hammer. "It calls the ones who remember." Fridas stepped beside him, her cloak catching the wind that now swept down from the ridge, sharp with the scent of moss, blood, and smoldering ash. "Do you mean the woven?" she asked. Cole shook his head once. "No. The others. Those beneath the sea. Those who never swore the oaths." The villagers began to murmur. Irmla, still kneeling, reached forward and touched the edge of the stone ring, her fingertips brushing ancient dust. She whispered something in a tongue even the ravens could not translate. Then came the second sound. Not a horn. Not a voice. A rustle. It began softly, like a breeze stirring dead leaves, but there were no leaves. It grew louder, sharper, until it filled the air like flint against flint, and soon all who stood in the ring realized it was not wind. It was teeth. Many teeth. Chattering, clicking, as though something vast and unseen ground its hunger between stone jaws beneath the very soil. Halder raised his axe. His voice was a growl. "They're rising." From the cliffs to the east, figures emerged, not men. Tall, thin shapes cloaked in salt-stained robes, their limbs too long, their movement too smooth. They walked not with weight, but with the slither of memory. Their faces were covered by woven bark masks, warped by age and sea brine, and where their eyes should have been, there were only holes filled with mist. Each carried a staff carved from driftwood, capped with a knotted rune that bled black sap. Cole stared at them without fear. "They are the forgotten," he said. Those the mountain cast out when the root first split. They remembered their own path. They were not bound. One of the sea figures stepped forward and lowered its hood. Its face was hollowed by time, skin like parchment over bone, but its mouth was full of shining teeth, too many for any creature born of woman. It opened them and spoke, though the sound was not heard with ears. Threadbearer. We saw the unweaving. We felt the cradle die. The bonds have loosened. We come now to bind again, on our terms. Cole's voice was soft, but it carried. No. You will not enslave the pattern again. The air thickened. The earth trembled. The forgotten raised their staves, and from the knotted runes poured strands of shadow, threads not of memory, but of hunger. They lashed out like whips, striking the snow and turning it to ash, coiling toward Cole, toward the seed thread, toward the villagers behind him. Friedis moved first, her axe a blur of silver, cleaving through one of the dark threads with a scream of steel. The thread hissed and turned to vapor, retreating. Halder charged with a roar, his broken spear reforged from bone and iron, striking low at the creature nearest. The blow landed, but the figure did not bleed. Instead, it split into strands of water and reformed behind him. Cole stood unmoving as the threads reached for him. Then, from the sky, a cry broke the veil. Ravens, hundreds, blacker than coal and glowing at the edges with the remnants of moonlight, descended. They struck the forgotten with claw and beak, not to kill, but to unravel. Wherever they touched, the dark threads untwisted, faded, vanished. The staves cracked. The mist broke. The fjord hissed. The forgotten hissed and turned as one, their bodies crumbling into strands of seaweed and mist, fleeing back toward the cliffs, back toward the water, back toward the silence from which they had come. Their voices trailed behind them. The thread will always bind. If not by root, then by rot. Silence returned. The villagers stood stunned, the wind now soft again. The snow resumed its descent, light, slow, sacred. Cole turned to Irma. They will return. She nodded. Yes. But next time, the thread will answer. He stepped back into the ring and touched the place where the seed had opened. A new thread began to grow, pale gold, clean, untainted. It drifted upward into the sky and vanished into the clouds. And all who watched felt the weight of the new loom begin to spin. The final snow came not from the sky, but from the earth. Pale flecks rose from the stone ring in Eldervac and drifted upward, slow as embers, glowing faintly with the memory of fire. Each flake bore a thread, invisible to the eye yet felt on the skin, like the shiver one feels when passing through the breath of a ghost. Above the ring, the air shimmered, and in its center spun the golden thread, grown long now, and braided with others, new ones, unseen until now. It turned of its own will, weaving slowly, as if hesitating before the birth of a new pattern. The villagers knelt in a wide circle around Cole and the thread. No voice dared to rise. Their faces were lit only by the goldspin that danced between them, casting long shadows that crossed and split like branches in the light of a dying moon. Even the wind had grown reverent. It passed through them without noise, without chill. It seemed to listen. Cole stood within the center, arms at his sides, his cloak still streaked with ash from the cradle hall. His hair had grown paler since the unbinding, now the color of old frost, and his eyes, once the gray of fjord ice, had taken on the color of raw amber. Behind him stood Friedis, silent, watchful, the rune scar on her palm faintly glowing where the last of the fire blood had etched itself into her flesh. Beside her, Halder waited, his axe grounded, a steady sentinel. And Irmla, oldest of the mountain's memory keepers, sat cross-legged in the snow, her sightless eyes turned toward the thread with a gaze that seemed to see more than any who had vision. The thread spun slower now. It hung suspended, waiting. Cole turned slowly and faced the people. They will come again, he said. The ones who rot, the ones who remember only power. They will seek to bind the world in their shape, as they did in the ages before the split. A murmur passed through the circle. Not fear, understanding. But this time, Cole continued, the pattern will not be woven by one will. Nor by a crown, nor a root, nor a cradle. Each of us will bear a thread. Each of us will remember. He raised his hand. The golden thread dipped, as though bowing. Then it split. Not in anger or breaking, but in gift. 1,000 smaller threads flowed from it, each drifting toward the villagers like strands of hair caught in slow water. As each thread touched a hand, or brow, or shoulder, it vanished. But the skin it kissed began to glow faintly, and the mark it left burned into the blood. A child wept. A mother knelt deeper. An old man sang without sound. Cole lowered his hand. The original thread now hovered still, faint but steady. "The loom is no longer in the mountain," he said. "It is in us." The mist lifted. And for the first time in 100 years, the stars returned. They shone cold and white over Eldervac, burning steady against the deep, black sky. The aurora crept once more from the north, not in silence, but in music, low, slow, old music, played by instruments no hand had touched in ages. The fjord gleamed like a mirror. The trees bent gently, no longer twisted by unnatural roots, but by wind alone. The longhouses exhaled smoke. The wolves howled in harmony again, and the snow fell clean, untainted. Cole stepped down from the ring. He passed through the people without word, and they parted, not out of awe, but out of kinship. At the edge of the village, he paused, and looked once more to the mountain. The peak was dark now, silent. But not dead. Only resting. Waiting for the next need to stir its roots. Fry disjoined him. She did not ask where he would go. He turned to her, and she to him, and for a long moment they watched each other, the way one watches fire, calm, but aware of the memory of burn. He spoke quietly. "The sea speaks of another cradle, far west. A place of bone and tide. It waits." She nodded once. "Then we go." Halder followed without a word. Irmla remained in Eldervac, seated in the center of the ring, her hands pressed to the stones as if listening to the hum of a thread no longer hers. And in the mountains, something deep and old turned once in sleep, and smiled. Thus the tale of the root and the thread passed from the mouths of the elders to the ears of the unborn, carried not in stone or ink, but in bone, in breath, in blood. Not all believed. But the thread did not need belief. Only memory.